Our story today is taken from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 3. But to understand the context of our story, we will begin reading from chapter 1. And it begins, "There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Year after year this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord." Verse 6, "Her rival used to provoke her severely, to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat." So here we have the opening scenes of our story. The setting is Israel in the days the people had settled in the land of Canaan. We are introduced to a man named Elkanah who has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah has no children, and so Peninnah mocks and provokes her about this year after year. This bullying is so prevalent, the author found it necessary to repeat this fact twice in the text. This dynamic happened during a time and in a culture where bearing children was not only viewed as a sign of a blessing from God, but in Israelite society it worked as a sort of rite of passage for women, where their value, belonging, and future provision would lean heavily on whether or not they had children, and particularly sons. And so for Hannah, not being able to have any children was a reality shrouded in shame, grief, and in this case, a good deal of mistreatment. Now each year this family, like other Israelite families, traveled to Shiloh at least once a year. Why? Because Shiloh was where the tabernacle tent was currently located. We can see here on the map, Shiloh was located in the hill country north of Jerusalem. Shiloh was in essence Israel's first capital. This was before Jerusalem and the era of kings happened, and so for about 300 years Shiloh was the epicenter of geographical religious significance to the nation. And just in case we need reminding, when we say the tabernacle, we are referring to a particular tent which God lived in. He came to live there first in the Sinai desert, circa 300 years earlier, during the days of Moses. After God had set free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, he came down from heaven to live among them. His tent pitched among the sea of their tents. The tent he lived in was called the tabernacle, or in Hebrew, mishkan, meaning dwelling place. And this particular tent was designed, per his instructions, in a specific way to symbolically convey certain things about who he was and how people could approach him and have a relationship with him. And so in the days of Hannah, God lives in Shiloh. Verse 3 tells us, year after year, Elkanah went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. The family would bring an animal to sacrifice. They would spend some days in Shiloh near the tabernacle, worshipping, eating together. Another detail we're also told in these first verses is that at present, Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. So we're told who the specific priests currently functioning in the tabernacle service are, and we're told their father is Eli. Eli is currently high priest in Israel. Our story continues from verse 9. Once they, that is Elkanah and his family, had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, If you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." So the family are eating, and Hannah gets up, and we can only guess why she leaves the dinner table. Because of what we've read in earlier verses, we can conclude it is likely Peninnah has been provoking her again. We're told that Eli is sitting on a chair by the doorpost by the entrance to the tabernacle. The fact that he can see Hannah suggests that she either has walked over to the entrance of the tabernacle, where Eli is seated to pray, or else the group is eating very close to the entrance. Most likely, she has walked over to the entrance, but either way, he has a full view of her approaching and what she does next. Now, typically, people would either sit on the floor or the ground, or perhaps even lounge, lying down when eating. The fact that there's mention of Eli sitting on a chair indicates his seat being a seat of honor. Basically, he is seated above all the rest. He is venerated for his position as high priest. So Hannah stands before the tabernacle, and verse 12 says, "As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth." Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. So Hannah brings her anguish, her frustration, directly to God. She approaches the tent, she is praying, and Eli assumes she is muttering to herself and drunk. Wine was present and drunk at many festival meals. She explains that she is simply bringing her sorrows to God, and Eli says, "Go in peace, and may God grant you what you have asked for." Verse 19. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." So Hannah conceives and bears a son. Some time passes, and we read in verse 22, Hannah said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." Verse 24, After he was weaned, she took the boy with him, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. Chapter 2, verse 11. Then they left him, that is Samuel, there before the Lord, and went home to Ramah. But the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. So Hannah keeps her promise. When Samuel is still very young, no older than 5 and perhaps even as young as 3, she brings him to live and serve in the tabernacle under Eli the high priest. Eli is in essence adopting Samuel, serving as a parent and a caretaker. And Samuel becomes his apprentice. The child will live with Eli in Shiloh. He will help with the various services a priest carries out and learn the priestly ministry in the tabernacle. But, we may say at this point, doesn't Eli already have sons? We were told he has two, Hophni and Phinehas. And they have already apprenticed with Eli and are already functioning as priests in the tabernacle. We were told they were the ones overseeing the sacrifices when Elkanah and Hannah went to Shiloh. Well, it's as though the biblical text preempts our question, because the very next thing we read is this. Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was still being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man said to him, "Let them burn the fat first and then take whatever you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now. If not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for they treated the offerings of the Lord with contempt. So to explain a little bit of what's happening here, God had set up a priestly system years ago in the Sinai desert. All priests in Israel were to come from one of the 12 Israelite tribes, namely Levi. The priests who worked at the tabernacle service did this full-time. That was their full-time job. And so how were they to be fed and provided for when they could not sow their own crops or rear their own animals? Well, the priests could eat part of the animal sacrifices. That was their food. That was how they were provided for in their vocation. They were basically fed at work. So people from all over would bring animals to be sacrificed. The animal would be slaughtered. Typically, the animal would be burned on the allocated altar until the fat of the meat was burned off. And after this was done, the priests could come and take part of the meat, cook it, and have it for their meal. This idea of the fat of offerings is reflected throughout the Old Testament. For example, David writes in Psalm 66, "I will offer to you burnt offerings of fatted calves." And if you know anything about culinary matters, you know that fat is a big component of flavor. The more fat is on a piece of meat, the juicier, the tastier, the more flavor that meat will hold. Now, some have interpreted burning the fat for God as symbolizing only giving the very best parts to Him. But this is projecting onto the text. Burning the fat was not about giving the best part to God. In the book of Leviticus, which is a book all about the Levites, the priestly order, and their ministry in the tabernacle, there is talk about a sweet aroma. And the priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma. All the fat is the Lord's. This mention of a sweet aroma pops up many other places in the Bible, but what is it referring to? The sweet aroma is referring to the physical fat that is burning, but its meaning goes deeper than that. When Israelites came to the tabernacle to sacrifice an animal, they would come here to the entrance of this section called the outer court. This section is the outside, walled in part around the tabernacle tent. It was in this court that the slaughter of sacrificial animals took place. When the animal had been slaughtered, it would be placed on this altar to burn. The smoke, the scent that rose from the burning animal, drifted from the altar in the outer court and into the compartment of the tabernacle where God himself was seated. As well as that, one of the priests would take a still burning coal from this altar and place it into this compartment of the tent called the holy place. He'd place the coal on a second smaller altar called the altar of incense. Now, what was the point of all of this? Well, it all has to do with sending a message to those watching. The smoke rising from the burning sacrifice in the outer court and the smoke from the coal inside the tent would, as we said, drift into the most holy place where God was seated. This was a visual symbol meant to communicate something to all the people. It was meant to symbolize prayers. The prayers of the person who brought the sacrifice. The smoke from the burning fat was a visual assurance and message that when you pray for forgiveness, for mercy, for help, for guidance, for thanks, your prayers will always reach God. Your words reach him. He hears you. He is not the far-off God way up in heaven who doesn't listen, nor is he like the other gods. Unlike with the other gods, with this God, you don't have to sacrifice yourself, cut yourself, dance, sing, make huge gestures, sacrifice your children, your blood, your body in order to be heard by this God. This sacrifice system was saying, you don't have to pay the price. God will always hear you. It is precisely the prayers of the people that make the aroma sweet. Quite strikingly, God not only hears his people, but their prayers are important and beautiful to him. And so all of this symbolic gesture isn't a matter of a deity being a bloodthirsty God, loving the smell of burning carcasses. In fact, he has much to say about how he doesn't care about that at all. But the significance, the thing which makes that smell sweet, is that it is the people's prayers, them reaching out, wanting to communicate and connect and ask for help. This is what is sweet to him. And so the fat wasn't just fat, it was symbolically rich. Burning the fat was a visual reminder to the Israelites that their prayers reach God. And with this in mind, perhaps we can now better understand that a part of the priest's service instructions was that the fat is the Lord's. In fact, there were very strict guidelines as to not convolute or muddy this symbolism and what it was meant to communicate to the people. Leviticus 7:25, anyone who eats the fat of an animal from which a food offering may be presented to the Lord must be cut off from their people. Don't eat the fat of offerings. Don't mess up the message it communicates. But what are we told Hophni and Phinehas are doing? They are sending in their servant to where the animal sacrifice is being burned. And instead of waiting for the fat to sizzle and burn off, instead of waiting for the leftover meat to be boiled so they can have their meal, they send their servant to demand that they be brought the raw meat before it's even been burned, because they don't want it boiled. They want to roast it themselves. Again, most food is better in flavor when fried or roasted, not boiled. Anyone who has experienced Northern European cuisine can attest to this. Meaning Hophni and Phinehas are messing with the symbolic act representing the people's prayers reaching God for the sake of them having a tastier dinner. Not only that, but, and if the man who is burning the sacrifice said to him, that is their servant, Let them burn the fat first and then take whatever you wish. He would say, No, you must give it now. If not, I will take it by force. The two priests, through their servant, are threatening violence towards others in the tabernacle service. Verse 18, But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord. Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. The story sort of goes, meanwhile, while Hophni and Phinehas are doing all these things, Samuel is ministering before the Lord in the tabernacle. It moves the focus back and forth between Eli's sons and Samuel. We are told Samuel's a boy wearing a linen ephod. An ephod was a linen apron worn by priests while they were serving. It was the work uniform of the Levitical priests. This communicates to us that Samuel seems to be serving as a priest. He is helping carry out the various responsibilities belonging to the priest, even as a boy. Then the story returns again to what Hophni and Phinehas are doing. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting, that is, the tabernacle. So he said to them, Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And then the focus shifts back to Samuel, verse 26, and the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. So throughout this passage, we're seeing this comparison happening, a shifting back and forth between look at what Hophni and Phinehas are like, and now look at what Samuel is like. Look at what Eli's sons are doing, and now look at what Samuel is doing. Not only are Hophni and Phinehas disrespecting the animal sacrifices, but we are told they are taking advantage of the women who serve around the tabernacle too, using their position of power to have sex with them, in essence, treating them like many other religions did. Women serving in temples would often be temple prostitutes. Using women's desire to serve or be close to God's dwelling place as an opportunity to violate them, causing them to be ostracized from their communities. Let that sink in. Hophni and Phinehas were meant to carry out a service which would help people glimpse what God is like, how they might approach him. Instead, they treat these women much like they did the sin sacrifices, like pieces of meat. The utter betrayal of taking advantage of women who wanted to serve God. And view this from the women's perspective. There was no buying condoms back then at your local gas station. If they became pregnant out of wedlock, they might be put to death, or at best be ostracized, and perhaps be condemned to a lifetime of prostitution just to survive. Also, if a woman felt that it was her fault, what happened, and she seeks forgiveness or restitution, where could she now go to find that? The very priests she would have to go to were the ones violating her. And what court in the land would side with these women over the men who are in charge of everyone's sacrifices? The revered Levitical priests. Their father, who sits on the high seat, is the high priest in the land. And it's not like this sort of thing still happens today, right? That would be absurd. If we have any doubt about how deadly serious God takes these horrible crimes, verse 25 tells us that God intends to have Hophni and Phinehas pay with their lives for what they've done. In case we have any doubt about how God responds when men in high-power religious positions take advantage of women, of the people they're meant to be serving, or who they're ministering alongside, let us remember the story of Hophni and Phinehas. Let us continue. Verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your ancestor out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice, an offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I said that members of your family would minister before me forever, but now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. So here a person who is simply referred to as a man of God comes to Eli with a message, and he prophesies about what is going to happen. God says, Eli, didn't I choose Aaron, your ancestor, and the tribe of Levi to serve me as priests? Didn't I make sure you were looked after? Why are you and your sons doing these things? Notice Eli is also eating these pieces of meat with fat on them. And God says, being ordained by me for a role, for a ministry, is not some eternal, inherent, unchangeable thing. You and your sons are twisting my message to the people. And so now I will raise up a different priest, a faithful priest, who will reflect my heart and mind. And God concludes this message with, then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so that I can have food to eat. This new priest that I'm appointing, Eli, your descendants, will come to him and plead for priestly work. They will bow down to him and ask for some priestly office and the food which comes with it. Basically, Eli, you and your line's monopoly on priestly ordination is coming to an end. And it is at this point that we arrive at chapter 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, you called me. But Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." There's a few important things to point out here. Firstly, the opening of this chapter is genius and worthy of giving one goosebumps. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. And then this happens. The second point to notice concerns sleeping places, where our characters are sleeping. Now, Eli is described as sleeping in his usual place. We're not told exactly where this is, but usually the Levitical priests slept in tents nearby or around the tabernacle. There are stories of them sleeping in tents inside the outer court, but more common was that their tents were pitched just outside the tabernacle complex. We're told it's Eli's usual place, so he's sleeping where he lives. But where is Samuel sleeping? End of verse 3. And Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Now, there's been much discussion among theologians about exactly where Samuel was sleeping. Some vehemently claim that the text cannot possibly be saying that Samuel is sleeping inside the tabernacle itself. That is unseemly, irreverent. Even adult Levitical priests don't sleep inside the tent of God. There are claims that surely Samuel was in the vicinity of the tabernacle. Like Eli, surely he was sleeping in a nearby tent, not in this tent. But this is what the text says. Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Where the ark of God was. Does this mean he was sleeping in the tabernacle compartment called the Most Holy Place? The compartment where the ark, the throne or seat of God was? The compartment where God lived and sat? The compartment which was forbidden for any to enter, except one day a year when the high priest alone would enter the Most Holy Place to present the sins of the people. The compartment where, if any entered, they would surely die. The text is very clear about one thing. Samuel was not sleeping nearby the tabernacle, he was sleeping in the tabernacle. At first glance, the text is not clear on which of the three compartments Samuel is sleeping in. Was it the outer court, the holy place, or the most holy place? Yes, the text says he's sleeping in the tabernacle where the ark of God was, but that doesn't necessarily mean in the compartment where the ark is. It is simply confirming to us, yes, he is sleeping in the tabernacle. Yes, that one, the tent where the ark of God is. But we can conclude for certain that this boy is sleeping inside the tabernacle. And because of the language, we are led to picture that Eli is not sleeping where Samuel is. These are two different locations. Eli would have to be close enough for Samuel to hear him if he calls out, but Samuel has to get up and go to where Eli is, suggesting a nearby location, but not the same. Eli could therefore very likely be in a tent nearby the tabernacle. The clue to where Samuel was likely sleeping comes in the very next sentence, verse 3. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. The lamp here is referring to a specific candlestick or a lampstand inside the tabernacle, otherwise called in Hebrew the menorah. The first time we see this word in the Bible is in Exodus 25:31, where God gives detailed instructions for a golden lampstand that is to be made and placed inside the tabernacle the Israelites were building. The lampstand as a whole was to be fashioned as a tree. Its base and center shaft represented the trunk, and the candlestick's arms represented 3 branches on either side, and the one in the middle. The top of the shaft of each branch was designed like an open almond flower. Each flower held an oil lamp, Exodus 25:32 and 37. This item was, as with everything else inside the tabernacle, trying to communicate something through symbolism to the people. There are several passages in the Bible that speak about the almond tree, which was the first tree to blossom and bear fruit in the spring. Now Aaron, Moses' brother, was the first of the Levitical priests, the ancestor and the first in line of all Levitical priests that would later minister. When God specifically chose Aaron to serve as a priest, he demonstrated his selection by causing Aaron's rod, his walking stick, to miraculously bud and grow ripe almonds overnight. You can read about this story in Numbers chapter 16. This was God using Aaron's rod as a sign to the Israelites of Aaron's unique priesthood to affirm the privilege of being chosen as high priest, and that this choosing only came through God's appointment. Now, to echo this symbolism, this lampstand, the menorah, was placed in the first section of the tabernacle called the Holy Place, and the lamp was tended to by Aaron and his sons. Their task was to never let its light go out. Exodus describes that the lampstand was to give forth light day and night, and the lampstand was the only source of light in there. This item symbolically communicated that God's priesthood, those people who were helping in a service to reflect God's character to others, would always shine. Like a light in the darkness, their light would never go out. The symbolism lasted far into the New Testament, where even in Revelation 1:20, John sees Jesus walking among 7 lampstands, 7 menorahs. And Jesus explains to John that the 7 lampstands represent 7 faith communities on the earth. How even during earth's darkest times, his priesthood, those who are reflecting his closeness, his compassion, his intentions to humankind, who are ministering and serving to others, still shine. Now, what does all this mean in our present story? Firstly, it suggests that Samuel is sleeping in the holy place compartment. The Lamb of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord. The language and mentioning these 2 factors in the same breath alludes to them being in the same place. Secondly, notice the language connecting certain facts. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, and the Lamb of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord. We are told Eli is technically blind. How is it that the lamp still hasn't gone out? If Eli is nearly blind, he cannot effectively carry out his tasks in the tabernacle. Tasks like replacing the bread, keeping the lamp burning day and night, sprinkling the blood on the curtain of the most holy place. He cannot carry out these duties, at least not without help. Imagine that dimly lit tent with only one light source for a nearly blind man. And based on our earlier description of Hophni and Phinehas, they aren't exactly faithful in carrying out the duties in their father's stead. They are off after the women and busy roasting their dinners. Everything we know about them suggests that they aren't reliable priests. So who then is either helping Eli or doing these tasks themselves? Well, Samuel the child. Either he is guiding Eli around, placing his hand on the bowl filled with blood, saying sprinkle here, or guiding Eli's hands to say here's the bread, or here's the oil to light the lamp. But most likely Samuel is also, or exclusively, doing these things himself. He is the one making sure the menorah, the lamp, doesn't go out. Day and night he's watching it. He's the one helping replace the bread. He's the one bringing the people's offerings and prayers to God. If Eli is the high priest in Israel, and Eli is unable to fully or partly carry out his duties, and his sons don't carry out those duties properly or at all, this means that Samuel is. Samuel is the one carrying out the duties of the high priest. Samuel is the one ministering for God's people. But this ministry work was reserved for adults, for priests who were 25 years or over. Then again, these were not exactly days when the Levitical priests were doing what they were supposed to. And here we come to a second beautiful thing that the mention of the menorah is alluding to. Because we've just had chapter 2 explain to us extensively about the evils of the priests, and it concluded with God sending a messenger to tell Eli, your line is about to be broken. But then we have this stirring sentence, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. That lampstand that represented Aaron's appointment, the ever-burning, ever-lit ministry of God's priesthood on earth, the one that looked like an almond tree blossoming, has not yet gone out. Things look bad, but the lamp of God is still burning. Just because some people have failed in their ministries doesn't mean God is giving up on ministering to people. He's just going to have to find someone else. Now God calls to Samuel where he's lying down. Eventually Eli realizes that it's God calling this boy, and he instructs his apprentice to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Note something here. Verse 10, the Lord came and stood there. He has personally come, is standing there and talking to Samuel. Verse 11, and the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was a test as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. To conclude this story today, we are going to highlight a few main points which this narrative demonstrates to us. Number 1, the first point concerns the failures of Eli. Eli was not a very good priest, and within these 3 chapters we can see this play out in a variety of settings and ways. First, in his interaction with Hannah. Eli served as a priest for many years. You'd think a priest would know a praying person when he saw one. A woman approaches the tabernacle, a place where people bring their prayers to God. Surely more than one person on his watch has prayed quietly, and his first assumption is that she's drunk. Eli would make for a poor pastor, lacking in discernment and emotional intelligence. Imagine a pastor seeing a woman weeping in the church pews. He walks up to her and gives her an earful about being a drunk. Where she sought comfort, she was met with accusation. Eli lectures Hannah, who is sincerely praying, while his own sons, whom he is not lecturing or correcting, are off getting drunk on food. And this woman, in pain, has to then spend her precious energy defending herself. Eli served as judge in Israel for 40 years, but his judgment of people doesn't seem all that wise. In fact, throughout the narrative, we find the author juxtaposing the actions and behaviors of the various characters. Hannah stood up, Eli sat down. Eli and his sons are doing these things, but Samuel is doing these things, ministering before the Lord. Eli is blind, but the lamp of the Lord is still burning. The rumors of Eli's son's wickedness spreads among the people, but Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. This comparing that is happening is meant to highlight to us both Eli's failures and how different Hannah, Samuel, and even the women serving around the tabernacle are from Eli and his sons. Not only has Eli taken part in breaking the law of God by eating the fat of sacrifices via his sons' actions, but he failed to restrain his sons from causing great harm in their vocation. He could have made sure there were consequences for their actions. And before anyone suggests that he wasn't responsible for his sons' actions, Eli was their boss. Not only that, he was high judge in Israel. He is the only one in a unique and authoritative position to stop them. But he does little to nothing to do so. His one mentioned attempt is half-hearted. He doesn't stop their corruption. Magistrate Eli, have you nothing to say about the violation of these women in ministry? Supreme Court Justice Eli, your gavel lies quietly on your desk. Even though judgment is not only within your authority, it's your responsibility, yet corruption is permitted to flourish under Eli's eye. Eli, in many respects, is a horrible leader and a terrible example. And he has failed and messed up both in his role as judge, as priest, and as a father, as a parent. Eli has failed at his ministries in life in every respect. And this isn't us reading into the story. God himself clearly says so in the text. The second point is the theme of hearing throughout this story. The choice of words, the imagery, the alluding to, hearing and listening permeates the narrative of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapter of 1 Samuel. It is the thematic backdrop, the golden thread running through these passages. Hannah praying to God for him to hear her request, but the high priest of God doesn't hear her, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli is both literally and figuratively failing to hear this woman. But God hears Hannah, and his response to hearing her, asking for help, was to remember her and act. Hannah calls her son Samuel. Samuel in Hebrew, Shmuel, sounds like the Hebrew for heard by God, from the root words Shema and El. In chapter 2, Eli heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours." His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke. Here we also have highlighted to us that it isn't so much what Eli's sons are doing, but the fact that people are talking about it that most concerns Eli. The fact that people know, they've heard, there's talk, rumors are spreading, and he has to hear about it. And despite Eli hearing about it from all the other Israelites, he still doesn't act. In the next passage, a man of God has to come to Eli and again state to him in clear terms, "This is what is happening. Why haven't you done anything about the things you have heard?" So back to the comparisons that are happening in this text. It seems that when God hears, as in the case of Hannah, he acts. But when Eli hears, he doesn't act. Even when Eli hears words from God himself, things don't change. Now, the central statement of belief among the Israelites was called the Shema. This was said as a prayer morning and evening. It was often the final lines spoken by Jews on their deathbed. Shema in Hebrew means hear or listen. Now, we typically associate hearing with the ear, and that is also one of the ways this word is used throughout the Bible. But Hebrew authors also use the word Shema to mean more than just let sound waves enter your ears. In Hebrew, Shema can also mean pay attention to or focus on, and it can mean responding to what you hear. This is why so many cries for help in the book of Psalms begins with a call that God Shema, listen, Psalm 27:7. So asking God to Shema is the same as asking God to act, to do something. And when God asks his people to Shema and keep his covenant, he's asking them to obey the terms of their covenant together. In fact, in ancient Hebrew, there is not a separate word for obey. So in biblical times, if you wanted to say, "I will listen to you and do as you say," you'd say, Shema. To hear is to obey. In Hebrew, listening and doing are two sides of the same coin. That's why when the Israelites break their covenant with God, you'll read prophets saying things like, "They have ears, but they're not listening." Now, with this in mind, we return to 1 Samuel. Chapters 1 and 2 have been expertly sowing seeds in our minds. Hearing, listening, All this weaving of hearing and listening being emphasized in the story begins to build into a height as we reach chapter 3, which begins with the line, "In those days the word of the Lord was rare." Now, because we have read the 2 chapters before, because we now understand what's going on among the priests in the land of Israel, because we understand the context, the author is guiding us to connect that in those days the word of the Lord was rare. And why might that be? Well, because nearly no one is listening. It's not a matter of God giving his people the silent treatment. He hasn't lost his voice. The word of the Lord is rare because they are not listening. And when he does speak, even their high priest does not act on it. He does not shema. Now God is taking the initiative and calling out to someone new, to a child. Will this child shema where the adults haven't? Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Again, the author is highlighting to us how Samuel differs from the adults around him. God calls, Samuel responds. Not once, he gets up and responds 3 times. At this point, Eli realizes the Lord is calling to Samuel, and he tells him to reply with, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I'd like us to take a moment to notice something here. I'd like us to notice that God is seeking consent. God is God of the universe. He can do whatever he likes, has limitless power. He can talk to whom he wishes and use whom he likes. But this God doesn't swarm a child while he's sleeping and dump a bunch of prophecy and messages on him without permission. Who is this God who seeks permission, who waits for consent from his creation, who respects the consent of a child? Who is this God who waits for, "Speak, Lord"? And what does that tell us about how we should be relating to consent? How we should be respecting the consent of our children? After all, if the God of the universe does, what makes us think we mustn't? Samuel says, "Speak, Lord." And only now does the Lord show up. Now the text tells us that he comes and stands there and says Samuel's name. "Speak, for your servant is listening. Speak, for your servant is shemaing." It would seem God has found someone in Israel who will listen. Which brings us to our third point. The third theme represented here concerns qualified people versus unqualified people. Eli and his sons are, on paper, the most qualified people in this narrative. The most qualified to be priests, to be high priests, to minister in the tabernacle, to receive and hear the words of God, to guide and spiritually nurture the people of Israel. They are Levites. They are of the right age. They have experience. They have the right lineage and ancestry. If they had been alive today, they would have gone through the best theological education. Each had a PhD in biblical studies, served decades as pastors, climbing up through the ranks to become directors, working at the union, the General Conference. Eli would be the General Conference president. His sons, well-known ministers of the Lord. Surely if anyone is going to be hearing a word from the Lord, it will be the General Conference president. According to God's own instructions, Eli and his sons are the qualified people to minister and guide God's people in this story. On paper. Now let's look at Samuel. First of all, Samuel is a child. He is not an adult. Secondly, Samuel is not a Levite. His father, Elkanah, an Ephraimite. Samuel was from the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim, the patriarch of this tribe, was the son of Joseph. The son of Joseph and the Egyptian woman he married while in Egypt. So the tribe of Ephraim could be seen by some as only half Israelite, only half legitimate. He's not even from one of the full proper tribes like Judah or Reuben. Only the Levites were allowed to serve as priests and high priests in the tabernacle, not according to people's rules, according to God's rules. Chapter 2, verse 30, the God of Israel declares, "I promised that members of your family, the Levites, would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. This tells us something about matters such as holy vocations, ministry, ordination, and calling. There is even today, as there was in Eli's heart, in Eli's day, an arrogance that can set in when God asks a group of people, or even an individual, to serve or minister in a certain way. This arrogance can lead one to think that one is superior to others. Not only that, but that calling and ministry, once ordained by God, is something that will never change or be taken away, no matter how the ministering person acts or behaves. And what is God's response to such thinking? Far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. Let this be a warning to anyone in any form of ministerial role, or who think they have been particularly chosen or set apart by God for something. No amount of being selected or chosen will ever mask the harm you do to others. Your position as elder, pastor, priest, youth leader, preacher, evangelist, Bible teacher, monk, theologian, priest, missionary, bishop, pope, church administrator, church president will never cover corruption, abuse of power, or your complacency towards the spiritual abuse by yourself or those in your charge. Remember, Eli did not sleep with those women or instigate the eating of the fat himself, but he did fail to stop it, and that made him complicit in those sins. A calling is not forever. An ordination is not a sealed deal. Just ask Eli and his sons. Ask King Saul, who came later on. How many spiritual leaders have held up their calling, their special selection, as a get-out-of-jail-free card to excuse the harm that they have done? You can be the most qualified person in the room. You can have years of ministry under your belt, be part of a chosen people, but do not delude yourself into thinking that God will continue to honor you or choose you when you will not Shema. God rejected the Levitical priests and went and spoke to someone else, ordained someone else. And look at the glory of the kind of people God speaks to and through. In a time when the word of the Lord was rare, Eli is silent. But in chapter 2, we find a whole prophetic soliloquy spoken by Hannah. She is standing next to the high priest of God, but it is Hannah whose mouth is filled with prophecy, about the bows of enemy warriors being broken, about how the hungry will be filled. Not only that, but the last line of her prayer is, "He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Hannah is speaking a prophecy about a king. At this time, there is no king in Israel. She's saying this before there is even a discussion of the Israelites wanting a king. But her son Samuel is going to anoint King David years later. In a time when the word of the Lord was rare, God spoke to a woman, while the high priest sits silently next to her. In a time when the word of the Lord was rare, God spoke to a child, while the high priest was next door. A woman instead of a man, a child instead of an adult, a boy from the wrong tribe instead of to a Levite. What does this story tell us about calling and ministry? It tells us that God chooses whomever he likes, that the seemingly qualified are not always qualified, and the seemingly unsuitable are sometimes exactly the best suited. and that ministerial ordination, calling, choosing of any kind, is not some static thing. God will speak to those who shema, not to those who inhabit the proper position or title, even if it was He who originally gave them that title. And it is here we arrive at our fourth and final point, what Eli did right. We've spoken of Eli's failures, how he failed on every front, in his ministry, as priest, as parent, as leader. But Eli's actions in chapter 3 also demonstrate him doing something very right. When Samuel, a child, his apprentice, comes to him in the night, thinking Eli's called him, and Eli realizes that God is trying to speak to Samuel, what feelings, what thoughts may Eli have had at that moment? Well, Eli could have asked, "Why isn't God speaking to me? After all, I'm the high priest. I'm the high priest in Israel. I've been chosen. I have served God for decades. For decades I have been judge and ministered in the Lord's house. Why is God speaking to this child and not to me?" But Eli doesn't lash out with disbelief about what Samuel is saying, nor does he respond with jealousy or hatred. He doesn't try to control the situation, saying, "You know what, son, I think you're young to be receiving the word of God. I think you're too inexperienced to be able to handle what he says. So just in case, I think I better come with you and hear what God has to say too." No, Eli stays put. And he empowers Samuel with the words to respond. "Go and say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" Not only that, but the next day Eli insists on Samuel telling him what God has said. Now there's a good chance that Eli already knows the gist of it. Why? Because a man of God has already come to Eli and pronounced judgment on him and his sons and their line. Samuel is afraid to tell his master what God said, because the news is bad and difficult, showing how Samuel is caring and empathetic. But the fact that Eli nearly threatens Samuel to not leave anything out suggests that Eli knows that it's bad news for him, and he still insists on not hindering Samuel in delivering his message. Eli makes sure that Samuel's care for the old man doesn't stop Samuel from carrying out his ministry. Sometimes the best thing that an elder can do is get out of the way. Sometimes the best thing an elder who has messed up their ministry, their legacy, failed at being a leader, at being a good judge, at being a good parent, the best thing they can do is get out of the way. Step aside and accept that God is choosing someone else. Step down and accept that God is speaking to someone else. Decenter yourself. Someone younger, someone less experienced, and seemingly unqualified, but yes, qualified in God's eyes, is listening when you're not. Here lies a very important lesson for anyone who is coming to the end of their life or who has many years of experience or service behind them. Sometimes the best thing that you as a failed leader, as a failed minister, parent, elder, a failed generation can do is to step aside, is to accept that God is speaking to children, to those younger than you, is to admit to your faults and failures and say, "Okay, my time is over. The least I can do now is make sure to support the children God is choosing, is speaking to, is getting through to. I haven't been listening. So the least I can do is encourage these children to listen to God and do as He says, not as I say, even if it hurts my ego, my legacy, my name, my future, and then to stay quietly seated in the other room, silently. At the end of the line of many, many failures, Eli did one right thing, which tells us even if you're a failed minister, it's not too late for you to do one right thing. Even in the days when the word of the Lord is rare, God will reach out to those who shema and who say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening."